Vampire legends have persisted all throughout history. Each culture has their own interpretations of what these creatures are, and refer to them by different names, but very few know where the legends of vampires originated. The way that vampiric creatures have been depicted for thousands of years is very different from how modern fiction portrays them, although vampires are depicted nowadays as being very similar to humans, and usually quite attractive. The original vampires were very different from humans, and they were hideous and parasitic. Many legends across the world describe vampires, but none of them gives us the full picture. We have to piece together legends from the past in order to uncover the full story of how vampires came to be a collective fear that has persisted in the memory of humans throughout history. This is but one of the legends of which the ancients spoke. Long ago, there existed a relatively peaceful world. Humanity was just getting its foothold. Cities were being built, and agriculture and the arts were developing. There was the occasional disagreement and some conflict here and there. In general, people lived in peace and security. But inevitably, corruption creeped in. 200 watchers were sent from heaven to help set humanity back on the path of righteousness. But these stars started to wander off their course. The watchers took advantage of their time on the face of the earth, deviating from their mission. They fraternized with humans, and they created unholy hybrid creatures by mixing their own DNA with the humans on Earth. And these hybrid creatures were known as the Nephilim. The first generation of these hybrid offspring were the most powerful, and it was only the first generation who was made directly from the union between the Watchers and the humans. The first generation of these hybrids were the largest to ever exist, and they've been remembered across the world by different names. The Nephilim, Asuras, Jotnar, and Titans, just to name a few. The Nephilim produced hybrid offspring of their own, and the lesser Nephilim that they created were all different from each other. But none of the resulting Nephilimic creatures were as powerful as the first generation Nephilim, since only the first generation Nephilim had been parented directly by the Watchers. The bloodline of all of the later Nephilim was diluted, and they lost most of their hybrid vigor over the generations. The first generation Nephilim, who were the most massive, required very large amounts of food to sustain themselves. Humans had initially brought sacrifices of plants and animals to the lesser Nephilim, who then presented that food to the larger Nephilim. And if they were not able to appease the larger Nephilim, then both the humans and lesser Nephilim were at risk of being eaten. And since the humans had no crops or livestock left to eat, the humans had to resort to eating things that the giants wouldn't eat, like bugs. Eventually, the humans ran out of food to feed the Nephilim, and so the massive Nephilim began to feed upon humans to satisfy their hunger. The ancient Hindu text, called the Mahabharata, states that in the ancient settlement of Ekachakrapura, the giant Rakshasa named Bakasura had to be provided a cart full of food regularly, and each cart of food always contained at least one human. Unlike humans, the lesser Nephilim had a symbiotic relationship with the greater Nephilim. Initially, the greater Nephilim refrained from eating their offspring, provided that the lesser Nephilim continued to bring food to the greater Nephilim. But since they had run out of crops and livestock to feed the greater Nephilim, the food that they brought typically consisted of humans. And the most powerful original Nephilim allowed the lesser Nephilim to feast upon the blood of the humans that they captured, while the greater Nephilim were given the flesh to consume, and the lesser Nephilim were forced to biologically adapt to the only food that they had access to, which was blood. And therefore, the blood-drinking lesser Nephilim became the first vampires. By consuming blood as their primary source of food, the lesser Nephilim became what are known as obligate hematophages, which means that they're biologically adapted and dependent upon consuming blood. The way that the bodies of the Nephilim would have reacted to the overconsumption of blood would be different to how the bodies of carnivorous animals react when consuming blood-heavy diets. Carnivorous animals inherently have the genes that give them very efficient antioxidant defense systems that neutralize reactive oxygen species, and are able to metabolize protein into compounds like short-chain fatty acids that reduce inflammation and protect their intestinal barrier. So carnivorous animals are designed to process consistently high amounts of heme iron in their diet, whereas humans are not designed to process such high amounts of iron, and neither would many types of Nephilim. Many carnivorous animals consume their entire prey, including the organs and the bones, which provides them with enough of certain vitamins and minerals that help them to metabolize iron. Much of the blood in their prey is also lost while they consume the flesh, in most cases. Since the lesser Nephilim were only consuming blood, they were not getting these extra vitamins and minerals, which made them even more prone to iron overload and excessive reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species bind to nitric oxide in the body, which reduces the bioavailability of nitric oxide. And there are several parts of the body that need nitric oxide to function properly, such as the lower esophageal sphincter. Having excess reactive oxygen species prevents the lower esophageal sphincter from being able to function properly, and this leads to a condition called achalasia. And achalasia prevents solid foods from being consumed, because the esophagus isn't able to contract or relax properly to allow solid foods through, and so this causes gagging during attempts to consume solid food, and so therefore it would become necessary to consume liquids for sustenance. And as for why they would need to specifically drink blood instead of other liquids, this is because of the nutrients that are in blood. Over extended periods of time of consuming certain types of nutrients in excessive amounts makes it to where the body doesn't need to produce those nutrients anymore. And so, the blood-drinking lesser Nephilim would have experienced the loss of the endogenous production of heme, which is actually the same thing that happened to cattle ticks, as one modern example. And so this would be another reason as to why the vampiric lesser Nephilim had become bound to blood drinking, and another reason as to why the lesser Nephilim would need to continue drinking blood specifically, instead of drinking other liquids like broth, is because their initial consumption of blood would have inhibited their UROD enzyme because of the excess reactive oxygen species produced in response to iron overload. And the UROD enzyme is needed to produce heme, meaning that these vampiric lesser Nephilim would lose their ability to produce heme as a response to prolonged hematophagy. And these traits could be passed down through their bloodline through transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. The way that porphyrias are treated nowadays usually involves blood transfusions and intravenous injections that contain glucose and hemin. Hemin is the word for heme when it's oxidized, meaning that it's been exposed to air. Consuming blood directly, as the Nephilimic vampires did, would therefore supply them with hemin and glucose, and help to alleviate the acute porphyria attacks that would begin affecting their nervous system after some time of not feeding upon blood. Many other species of existing animals have recently adapted to consuming large amounts of blood to compensate for a lack of other resources in their environments. Their microbiomes have also shifted to have certain types of bacteria that feed off of iron, which helps to prevent iron overload. But it is still possible to get iron overload, especially before the body has fully adjusted to the consumption of high levels of iron. Even though the Nephilim were practically immortal, due to their negligible senescence, and because they were descended directly from angels, the Nephilim were also part human, and sometimes part animal, and so they still had to face the consequences of mortality in certain conditions. In perfect circumstances, they were able to live indefinitely, but they were also capable of perishing due to starvation or injury, and this applies to both the first generation Nephilim and the later generation lesser Nephilim. Organisms with negligible senescence and negative senescence are able to counteract the effects of aging, and therefore, theoretically, be able to live indefinitely in the right circumstances. Even though negatively senescent organisms are able to repair cellular damage and damage to their DNA, which usually prevents them from aging, there are certain factors that could still accelerate their aging past what their body is able to naturally repair. And as I had mentioned earlier, consuming large amounts of blood, especially when the body isn't biologically designed to handle reactive oxygen species, causes damage to the organs and the cells. And so therefore, the blood-drinking lesser Nephilim would have experienced rapid aging as a result of their frequent blood drinking. But this isn't necessarily the case, depending on who they were consuming blood from. And this would explain why vampires are known to seek out the blood of younger organisms, specifically. They usually consume the blood of younger people in order to reverse aging and appear younger. Scientists have discovered something called heterochronic parabiosis, which involves giving an older organism the blood of a younger organism, which is usually done by grafting the two organisms together, but it can also be done through blood transfusions. And in studies that researchers have done, they found that injecting an older organism, such as a mouse, with the blood of a younger organism actually prevents and reverses aging in the older organism. There are certain components in blood, like hormones, enzymes, RNA, extracellular vesicles, and mitochondria, that the body can use to repair itself when these components come from younger organisms. Even though ingesting blood would cause some of these components to break down due to digestion, other components would still be preserved and be utilized in the body, and help to partially counteract the negative effects of reactive oxygen species. But directly injecting the blood of younger organisms into themselves would be even more beneficial, because none of those components in blood would be broken down due to digestion. There haven't been any studies on the effects of bathing in blood, and if this also causes rejuvenation, but if it does, that would explain why bathing in blood has been practiced historically. As a way to manage their temporary iron overload symptoms, the vampiric lesser Nephilim may have conducted phlebotomies or regular bloodletting on themselves, which is a common treatment nowadays for iron overload. Bloodletting would help their bodies to remove excess iron, while their bodies process the rest of the nutrients from the blood that they consumed. Hence the bloodletting rituals that people have been replicating throughout history. Oftentimes these blood rituals were done by the same cultures who sacrificed blood to deities who were the surviving lesser Nephilim. If a modern human were to consume large amounts of uncooked, raw blood, they would most likely contract many different diseases, which is one reason as to why you should never consume blood. As time went on, there were less humans available for the Nephilim to eat. The remaining humans hid from the Nephilim so that they wouldn't be eaten. And once that occurred, the original Nephilim started to turn on their own hybrid children due to their insatiable hunger, causing many of the lesser Nephilim to flee and hide in places like cave systems. Inevitably, a massive war broke out between the Titanic Nephilim, and eventually all of the original Nephilim had been destroyed in war. In Greek texts, this event was known as the Titanomachy. In the Mahabharata, this war was known as the Battle of Kurukshetra, and in Norse mythology, this battle was known as the Aesir-Vanir War. This battle between the giants was also described in the Book of Enoch. The Watchers, who were the fathers of the first-generation Titanic Nephilim, were imprisoned by the archangels Raphael and Michael beneath the earth under the orders of God. All of the harm that the original Nephilim had caused humanity in order to sustain their lives had been in vain. With the conclusion of the Titan Wars, humanity had the chance to start recovering, with their biggest threat eliminated, but there were still other threats lurking in the shadows. Many of the freakish offspring of the Nephilim were still around, including those who had lived with the original Nephilim and who had become biologically dependent upon the consumption of fresh blood. Once the titanic Nephilim were eliminated in battle, the blood-drinking smaller Nephilim, who had not perished in the Titan Wars, were still bound to blood drinking, and they went out and hunted for their own food as vampires. In order to protect humanity against the lingering threat of the surviving Nephilim, God gathered the chosen humans and animals who were pure of blood and not yet corrupted into an ark, and all life was destroyed from the face of the earth. But elsewhere, there were still other survivors, some of which had been drinking blood since the days before the cataclysm. Many of the Nephilim had remained in hiding, and some of the Nephilim were aware that an even greater disaster than the Titan Wars was going to occur, and so they prepared by building their own arks of stone. According to the writings of Abu Balki and the Handbook of Freemasonry, the people and giants in the ancient world were made aware that a great disaster was going to occur and destroy the world, but they didn't know if this disaster would be by fire or by water, and so they built structures that could survive either, and some of these structures were designed to be hermetically sealable in order to keep out any water in the event of a flood. Despite the fact that the descendants of the Nephilim were always smaller than the first generation, some of these descendants were still larger than others, hence the massive difference in size between some of these so-called sarcophagi. You can make out indentations that were carved into the interior of the sarcophagi, where there may have been things like machinery attached. It's possible that CO2 to oxygen converters could have been placed inside to recycle the oxygen inside of the sarcophagi while the Nephilim were hibernating. Ancient peoples such as Neanderthals could hibernate, and there are numerous examples of modern humans drastically reducing their metabolisms in order to survive in harsh conditions. So it's entirely within the realm of possibility that the Nephilim could hibernate and did so to survive the Great Flood in their waterproof survival chambers. When the Great Flood did eventually occur, some of the Nephilim entered into these survival chambers, and they entered into hibernation. But not all of the Nephilim who had attempted to survive the Great Flood by hibernating in survival chambers ended up making it out alive. In many cases, these so-called sarcophagi were not properly protected, and they ended up being buried in depositional sediment during the flood, which trapped them inside, and so they ended up not surviving. But in most cases, the Nephilim who had used these survival chambers during the flood did eventually end up re-emerging, and if you study archaeology, you'll know that most of these large, hermetically sealable stone sarcophagi were found empty. Even though the surface of the world had been wiped clean during the flood, there were still air pockets of survivors who had memories of the pre-flood worlds. And although some Nephilim had become obligate hematophages, there were still many Nephilim who had never become dependent on blood drinking, and so they still consumed solid food. And so some of the Nephilim had taken provisions with them into their survival chambers, food that they had preserved. And this food would be the same as what they were already accustomed to eating, but jerkied, preserved for later consumption. Many of the earliest mummies that had been created before the flood were not prepared in the same funerary sense, as many of the post-flood mummies. These pre-flood bodies that were preserved were very obviously done so with the intention of preserving them as a food source. The bodies were salted with natron, which is an edible salt, as a means to preserve them, just like how people have been using salt to preserve other types of meat for thousands of years. And they were covered in a mixture of fats and resins that were mixed with spice, which was done so with the intention of enhancing their flavor. The ancient pre-flood people in the area of southeastern Asia actually went as far as to smoke their mummies in order to preserve them, in the same way that meat is often smoked in order to preserve it for later consumption. And when the hibernating Nephilim reawoke, those of them that were still capable of consuming solid food had plenty to eat, while other Nephilim had become obligate hematophages and were unable to consume solid food, and so they had to go out in search of fresh, liquid blood that they could feed on. And the reason why vampiric creatures are believed to be undead is because they had originally emerged from places that were mistakenly believed to be tombs, when they were, in reality, hermetically sealable survival chambers, which had been built before the Great Flood. Regardless of their type, many of the Nephilim survived, and produced offspring, which still exist in isolated populations, and have been seen all across the world up to the modern era, having speciated separately from humans, and separately from each other too, depending on where and how they lived, and many of them have become well known for their horrendous acts of blood drinking. The reason why the vampiric Nephilim chose to remain in hiding after the Titan Wars, and for the most part, after the Great Flood, is actually related to their blood drinking, which can trigger a variety of biological responses, such as porphyria, and this condition results in a buildup of porphyrins in the bone marrow. And these porphyrins make their way to the skin, which causes massive sensitivity to sunlight, which can cause the cartilage on the ears and the noses to be lost due to damage, and can also cause other affected body parts like the fingers to be lost due to severe burns. And porphyria also sometimes causes hypertrichosis, which protects any skin that's exposed to sunlight. So vampiric Nephilim would only be able to go out at night comfortably, and they would attempt to acquire blood to feed on while safely hidden from the sun. Long-term iron overload would result in organ damage, especially to the liver and the skin, and this would make the effects of porphyria permanent, which is why, even though the bodies of the vampiric Nephilim would have adjusted to regular blood consumption over time, they would still have to avoid sunlight for the rest of their very long lives, or else they might physically face the consequences of severe burns. And the avoidance of sunlight would have negative consequences on their offspring over generations, especially if the blood drinking habits were passed down generationally. Iron overload can cause iron to accumulate in the skin cells. In non-albino people, this can trigger the overproduction of melanocytes, causing a more bronze appearance. But in people with lower melanin production rates, their skin instead develops a silvery or slate gray appearance, which would explain why many of the different types of creatures that people have cited often have gray skin. Other creatures have been depicted as having green skin, which indicates that they have excessive biliverdin in their blood, which can be a symptom of anemia, as I had mentioned in a previous video in regard to the green children of Woolpit. But iron overload can also have anemic symptoms, including jaundice and hyperbilirubinemia. So excessive iron consumption could also contribute to a greenish appearance, since iron overload can cause damage to the liver, which reduces its ability to remove biliverdin and bilirubin from the blood. And various different types of skin discoloration that could be caused by iron overload anemia or hemochromatosis, is seen in many of the larger-sized people depicted in older mythological texts, especially the figures who were associated with blood sacrifices. This is another reason as to why vampires are mistakenly believed to be undead, because their skin often has a gray hue due to hemochromatosis, as a result of their body's response to hematophagy. It's well known that cave animals tend to not have pigmentation, and the reason why is because there's a selective pressure for those with less melanin to survive. And the reason why is because producing melanin requires a substantial amount of energy from the body, which burns calories. And so this can actually be detrimental in conditions where food is not abundant, but only if melanin is not necessary, because not having melanin makes the skin very sensitive to sunlight, and also prone to skin cancer, which is what happened to Snowflake the albino gorilla, even though his zookeepers gave him sunscreen daily. Over generations of sunlight avoidance, similar selective pressures would have affected the descendants of the lesser vampiric Nephilim, and this could either appear as having pale skin and red or blonde hair, or it could express itself as albinism. And this lack of melanin would cause a positive feedback loop of avoiding sunlight and facing more selective pressures for having less melanin. People with albinism tend to have the same physical traits that vampires typically have, being pale skin, white hair, and bright red eyes. And the reason why is because they have no melanin to tint their skin, hair, or eyes. The reason why their eyes are often red is because they have no melanin to tint their irises, and so the reason why they appear to be red is because you're actually seeing their blood vessels. And if a person who has albinism were to also have jaundice, and therefore a buildup of bilirubin in their blood, then their blood would appear to be yellow, and therefore their skin and their eyes would appear to be yellow, hence why many vampires are depicted as having yellow eyes. The reason why vampires are said to have cold skin could actually be because of a trait that's shared with other organisms that have negligible or negative senescence. There have been some different types of mammals which were actually cold-blooded, such as the Myotragus bularicus goat and the naked mole rat. And in mammals, this is called poikilothermy. And poikilothermy is an adaptation to living in low-resource environments. It also happens to be a trait that negligible or negatively senescent organisms share in common. Poikilothermic organisms have a lower metabolism than warm-blooded animals, and this makes it so that they can survive significantly longer, even without access to food. Both vampiric and non-vampiric Nephilim are said to be immortal, indicating that they have negligible or negative senescence, which means that they were also likely to have been poikilothermic, hence their colder skin. There are other traits that are commonly associated with vampires, such as sharp teeth and pointed ears. It is entirely possible for people to be born with these traits, even just randomly, and these mutations are heritable, so they can be passed on to offspring, such as in the case of hypohidrotic ectodermal dysplasia. People with this condition tend to have sharp teeth due to a lack of enamel, and they also generally don't grow adult teeth, and so their initial pointed teeth are permanent. And while their teeth can be fixed by a dentist, if they don't receive treatment, then their teeth remain pointed into adulthood. And the hair that they do have tends to be very sparse and falls out easily. And another interesting feature is that they usually have no sweat glands. A condition like hypohidrotic ectodermal dysplasia would actually be useful for stealth, either for hunting or hiding. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries in Japan, the shinobi ninjas avoided eating foods that had a strong aroma to prevent their bodies from having any detectable scent, including from their sweat, so that they would be able to sneak up on their targets without being detected. Those among the cave-dwelling vampiric lesser Nephilim who may have lacked sweat glands would be able to survive longer by evading detection and be able to hunt and hide more effectively because of a lack of body odor, since they had no sweat glands. and they would pass down these traits to their offspring, making it so that the absence of sweat pores and other mutations along the same genetic pathway would be more common in their respective populations over the generations, hence why some types of Nephilim, who had descended from the same bloodlines, have the same traits. Of course, I'm not saying that all people with this condition are descendants of Nephilim or cave dwellers. Hypohydrotic ectodermal dysplasia can affect other species too, aside from humans, and might be more prevalent in certain isolated populations of other species, such as the descendants of the Nephilim, who had survived in some regions. Many descendants of the Nephilim that people have encountered throughout history, which tended to also be vampiric, in some cases seem to also have hypohydrotic ectodermal dysplasia, or a similar genetic condition. And other isolated populations of Nephilim descendants have other physical traits that were passed down throughout their respective isolated populations, with some offspring resembling trolls, and others having larger eyes and frailer bodies, and some resembling Bigfoot or dogmen based on their genetic makeup. The Nephilim didn't always have only human and angel DNA. Oftentimes they also had animal DNA too. There are certain non-human entities that have been encountered, and the traits that they're described as having are consistent with what would be expected of cave-dwelling, hematophagous organisms. The typical gray aliens have large eyes, which are consistent with the characteristics that animals living in low-light environments have. Nocturnal animals like owls and felines have larger retinal orbits, and in some cases their pupils span the entire visible surface of their retinas in order to maximize their light absorption. And long-term avoidance of light could actually cause an atrophy of the iris sphincter muscle, and this would make it to where their pupils are unable to constrict properly, which would explain why these creatures have large black eyes, because of their living in low-light environments long-term. Sometimes in lighter environments, light enters into their eyes and bounces back off of their retinas, which makes their eyes appear to glow red. And other humanoids like the Hopkinsville goblins and the Pleiadians are also described as having larger than normal eyes, and they're also described as having albinism and jaundice. And these goblin-like creatures that are called aliens also are described as having gray skin, which again is an indication of hemochromatosis due to excess iron consumption. Many aliens are also described as having green skin, similar to goblins, which, as I had mentioned earlier, is an indication that they have a buildup of biliverdin in their blood, which is a symptom of iron overload anemia, as well as acquired refractory iron deficiency anemia, which can be caused by a shutdown of heme synthesis and could be acquired as a response to the overconsumption of heme. And the chupacabra was described as having a similar appearance to aliens. If these creatures are emerging from caves, such as one of the many caves in Puerto Rico, this would explain how they're able to emerge suddenly and then go back into hiding. Unlike the previously mentioned Nephilim descendants that did not have sweat glands, other types, such as the chupacabra and the creatures cited in Varginha, Brazil, still did have sweat pores, and were described as having a very strong odor. Blood contains high amounts of amino acids and nitrogenous waste products, which a blood-drinking creature would excrete out in the form of ammonia. And this is the most likely to occur with a diet that's very high in amino acids and low in carbs and fats, because ammonia is a byproduct of amino acid breakdown. And blood is very high in amino acids, which the body can readily use as a food source and even convert into glucose using gluconeogenesis, and fats through lipogenesis. If these creatures consume blood as their primary food source, that would explain why their jaws are so small, because the muscles in their jaws are undeveloped due to not being used, since they don't have to chew blood, similar to the jaw shrinkage and malocclusion that humans experienced during the agricultural revolution. The reason why vampires are so often depicted as gigantic, or as resembling fallen angels, is a reference to their lineage, with vampires being the descendants of Nephilim and the Watchers. Angels were well known for their ability to shapeshift, usually appearing as humans in order to be more approachable, since their true form is apparently frightening. In the book of Ezekiel, angels are described as having the heads of bulls, humans, lions, and eagles, and this doesn't mean that they had all of these heads at once. It meant that angels were able to shapeshift into these different forms. And this is the same reason why many entities depicted in ancient art were shown as having different heads and different forms, because they were able to shapeshift. It didn't mean that they specifically looked like this. This is how the Titan Proteus was classically depicted, as a way to show that he was known for shapeshifting, as might be expected from beings that are descended from angels. Giants were said to be shapeshifters as well, in the same way that vampires in folklore are described as shapeshifters. The Jotnar in Norse mythology were able to appear as giant serpents, wolves, and as human women, and the exact same was said of the Rakshasas in Hindu mythology. The Rakshasa would appear as other gods, such as the Garuda, and to make themselves appear even more monstrous and ferocious. And it's well known that the Titans in Greek mythology were also said to be able to shapeshift. Sometimes they turned themselves into animals or inanimate objects, and they were also able to appear larger and smaller at will. With the knowledge that vampires are actually the descendants of Nephilim, who themselves are the descendants of the Watchers, vampires too would be able to shapeshift, which is something that vampires in mythology and folklore over the past several thousands of years have been described as doing. Even though vampires are usually just depicted as turning into bats, or into some kind of winged humanoid beast, they've also been said to turn into beautiful women, giant black dogs, horses, cats, and as regular humans in order to blend in. When humans die, their souls rest until Judgment Day. However, Nephilim were abominations at birth, causing their souls to be instantly condemned, which means that when Nephilim die, they do not sleep until Judgment Day. They're cursed to wander the earth, awake and still hungry for worldly pleasures, which is why they possess people and animals. The rogue spirits of dead Nephilim are known as demons. When God-fearing humans pray for protection over their households, God protects them from evil entities. Since vampires have an evil, condemned soul, they're also prevented from entering into a blessed household, and therefore vampires and any other type of evil creatures, such as aliens and the black-eyed children, are only able to enter into a blessed house if the owner is stupid enough to invite them in, which is why these entities have to ask for permission to enter and make up various excuses to come inside. The same applies to evil entities being able to enter into bodies. God's protection of your household and your body applies to all types of Nephilim, living or dead. And this is the same reason as to why vampires are warded off by crucifixes and the name of Jesus. Thank you to those who have recently supported Shattered History: Steve Schopel, Doc Benson, F. I-Man, M.R., John R. Aman, Ambugaton, A.L.V., Mama Lou, Liam Flatley, Nathaniel Lee, Love God First, Everything Else Second, J. Ridenauer 5887, and Cakes 73.